Hello, everyone. Hope you're having a fantastic day. My name is Kmart, and I want to talk about some basketball. And today, we are carrying on with our series of preview videos for the first ever in-season tournament in the NBA. We've gone through about half the groups now out of the six that will exist in the format for this inaugural in-season tournament. So we're getting into the back half of the groups now. So we are going to be jumping into that in just a second. A couple of reminders though. First and foremost, we are in now part 4 of this preview series. So if you want to watch any of the previous videos, there will be a link to that playlist. I think there's something clickable up in the top right of your screen. We'll also put a link to the playlist in the description of this video as well if you want to see some of those other groups that we previously talked about. So there's the plug. Now we'll go over the format for this video once again in case you haven't seen any of the previous ones. We've got 5 teams in this group. We're going to be dividing those 5 teams into 3 sections in terms of the viability of them winning the top spot in that group. We'll have a favorites category, a contenders category, and a long shots category. So we will divide the 5 teams amongst those 3 categories. After that, I'm going to talk about one team that I think is most likely to outperform that projection, and then, of course, one team most likely to sort of underperform in their projected spot as well. So, there's a quick rundown of the format. With that in mind, we'll get into it. We are looking at West Group B here today. And the teams in that group are the Dallas Mavericks, the Denver Nuggets, the Houston Rockets, the Los Angeles Clippers, and the New Orleans Pelicans. So, well, what could be a relatively competitive group here, at least maybe around the middle, but let's explain that logic as we get to it. For now, we are going to start things off with the favorite section of West Group B, and this one is about as simple as it gets. There is one team in this category, and that team is the defending champion Denver Nuggets. This one's about as easy as it gets, right? The Nuggets are the defending champions. They are one of, if not the best team in the league, and their lineup remained pretty consistent through the offseason. Really only losing some minor parts, right? Sort of Bruce Brown, the biggest one, who gets maybe kind of poached by opposing teams, but this is still most, if not all, of the sort of core that just won a championship. So as long as guys like Jokic, Murray, Michael Porter Jr. don't end up hurt in the first couple months of the season, the Nuggets are the clear, very, very clear favorite to win this group. So real quick off the bat with that one, just because it's that easy to predict. But that moves us along to category number 2, the contenders. This is where things got maybe slightly more difficult to look into. The first team we have in the contenders list is the Los Angeles Clippers. And like all discussions about the Clippers over the past couple of years, this one comes down to the health of their star players. If Paul George and Kawhi Leonard are healthy to start the season, if they're ready to go, if they're playing at 100%, then the Clippers will be dangerous. To be honest, the Clippers looked like they could have been even more dangerous earlier on in this offseason when talks of the James Harden trade were still going down, but obviously those talks have been kind of killed, at least on the Philadelphia side, if they ever even existed in the first place. So the Clippers will not be getting James Harden. At least it doesn't look that way for now. So it really does revolve around those star players. If Paul George and Kawhi Leonard are 100% healthy and playing together, it feels like that smooths over a lot of the other concerns for the Clippers here in terms of their supporting cast. So Clippers just have to sort of pray that those two are finally healthy and playing at the same time, because that has not happened all too often. But here's hoping for the Clippers' sake that it does this season. Moving on to team number 2, though, in the contenders category, we've got the New Orleans Pelicans. This one also is going to come down to health a little bit here. If Zion Williamson is healthy and playing and his off-court stuff has been dealt with and put aside, then this position's locked in, right? The Pelicans at a certain point last season with Zion playing were the number 1 seed in the West. And that status did not last very long, I will admit that, but we saw, if this team was fully healthy, a brief glimpse maybe of what it is that they're actually capable of doing. So if Zion's back and he's at 100%, this Pelican squad still looks pretty similar to that one last season. So I think the Pelicans are in a pretty solid spot to compete in this group. Maybe have a chance at contending with Denver. Of course, that still feels like a stretch because of just how good Denver is right now, but the Pelicans are in a good spot if they have Zion. If they don't have Zion, it might get a little bit more difficult. I think that the Pelicans could still contend in this group for sure with what they've got currently with no Zion Williamson, but obviously it gets a little bit more difficult, and we saw the team struggle with what was a Zion-less lineup for a lot of the season. And maybe struggle is not even the right word, but they weren't at their full potential for sure. So the core is still intact. The young pieces are improving pretty rapidly, so there's plenty to be positive about for the Pelicans. But we'll see what health sort of does for them in the first couple of months of the season. But that moves us along to our final team here in the contenders section, and this is the one that I think is maybe the hardest to defend. I've got the Dallas Mavericks here in this section. I know there's a lot of people who are going to sort of be down on the Mavericks because of the way that their season ended, the previous campaign. Right, they got Kyrie Irving, they brought him in, their defense looked terrible, they could not dig themselves out of the hole that they had found themselves in the second half of their season, and eventually they shut the whole thing down and didn't even play guys like Luka and Kyrie down the stretch so that they could try to save their draft pick. So all of that looks terrible, but I think round 2 of the Luka Kyrie experiment can start strong for the Mavs to hold this spot. I feel like a lot of the Mavericks' issues last season that got projected onto Kyrie and Luka not being able to work together was because the Mavericks were already pretty far behind where they wanted to be when the trade even happened. Right? And yeah, you look at their win-loss record, it wasn't fantastic, but expecting an instantaneous and immediate turnaround just because you traded for Kyrie Irving seemed a little unreasonable at the time as well. But now you've had a full off season, you brought Kyrie back, you're going to have training camp preseason to get him ready. I think the team will be better adjusted to working around this sort of star duo of guards here and maybe playing a little bit more effectively. And I definitely think that the Mavericks have done some things to shore up the other weaknesses in their lineup. They got some young guys in the forward and center positions. Young does also mean untested, but we'll see how they play things out. And they took a pretty sizable step in maybe shoring up their defensive effort, which was pretty damn bad in the second half of last season, by making that trade for Grant Williams. But the Kyrie Irving re-signing kind of stole headlines for the Mavericks, but Grant Williams is a very solid defensive pickup, and I can't imagine a scenario where you put Grant Williams out there and he busts his ass on defense, does basically the same things that he was doing for the Celtics, and that doesn't lift the overall level of defensive play from the rest of the Mavericks, right? There's only so many times you could see a player go out there and take a charge or actually give a shit on defense without it sort of rubbing off on some of the other players in the lineup as well. Now, do I think Luka or Kyrie suddenly becomes an elite defender? Absolutely not. That's really not their game. They're almost entirely focused on offense, and that's okay for now. But the rest of the lineup around the Mavericks could sort of stand to play a little bit better defensively, and I think Grant Williams is going to help facilitate that. So If all of that goes to plan, the Mavericks fit in this section. I know I just listed off a lot of moving parts, but that is sort of the hope here, that everything falls into place and the Mavericks get back into contention. Maybe seems like a bit of a stretch, but at least back into the playoff picture after missing all of the postseason last year. So, here's hoping things go well for the Mavericks. But that moves us into our final category here, the long shots. Just got the one team in it, and it's a team that most people would probably agree with. We've got the Houston Rockets in this final section, and it's pretty clear why. They were one of the worst teams in the league last season. They've been a pretty bad team for a while now, basically since James Harden left and they went for the full rebuild. Now, I will say, there is a chance that the Rockets get significantly better this year, right? They did pretty sizably overpay for Fred VanVleet. They picked up Dylan Brooks just because Memphis didn't really want him anymore, and those are guys who can make an impact, right? Ignore the price tag of Fred VanVleet. Ignore the off-court clownery that Dylan Brooks sort of put together last season and look at their numbers and their contribution. They can make the Rockets a better team, for sure, mostly because the Rockets were, again, one of the worst teams in the league last season, so there's really nowhere to go but up, but keep it positive, right? Fred VanVleet, Dylan Brooks come in, they're experienced, they know what they're doing, they're being added to a stable of incredibly talented, potential-wise, young players here, right? They've got a lot of guys 25, 26 and under on that Rocket squad, and by the end of the season, some of those guys may have developed to the point where a very clear hierarchy now exists with the Rockets, whereas last season it was very much sort of fluctuating, right? We had stretches where one prospect or another was sort of high or low, and the Rockets were okay with that because they weren't planning on winning too many games. But now we'll see if consistency sort of wins out in terms of the performance of some of these players. But the problem with that is that that's not going to come in the first 2 months, or I'm fairly certain that it's not going to, right? Talked about their young guys developing. Well, I'd say that development would show more in the second half of the season than in November, right? So, if you're the Rockets, I think that the future is bright. Things are going to get better for your team in the long run, but by the time the in-season tournament begins, I'm almost certain that they won't be there yet. So, in the long shot section, it's possible, but it's extremely unlikely. So, that is our 5 teams sorted into their categories. We'll recap that real quickly. Standing alone in the favorite section, we have the Denver Nuggets. In the contenders category, we've got the trio of the Los Angeles Clippers, the New Orleans Pelicans, and the Dallas Mavericks. And that leaves us with the lone long shot squad being the Houston Rockets down there at the bottom. So, with the teams sorted into their categories, we move on to our next segment here. One team that I think will exceed expectations and one team that will potentially disappoint. So, for the team to potentially outperform their projections, I am going to go with the New Orleans Pelicans here. I mentioned in their section that so much of their potential rides on Zion Williamson, and I'm kind of sticking to my guns on that point. If Zion is back and the rest of the core doesn't sort of slip up or get themselves hurt, I suppose, then I could see New Orleans doing well enough to snag, well, I don't know if they'd snag the number 1 spot in this group outright, but they could at least threaten the Nuggets for it. And if they don't win the group, they could at least contend for that sort of lone wild card spot, right? If you have forgotten or are unfamiliar with the format, the winner of each group goes on to the next round, and then the best second place team from each conference also goes on to the second round. So if Zion is healthy, can the Pelicans beat the Nuggets? Maybe, but I would probably lean more towards no. But if Zion's back, they can absolutely be the best second place team and get that slot anyway. So a lot of it rides on Zion because we saw what the rest of the core could do, right? McCollum, Valanciunas, Ingram are still very solid, very strong. I mean, Ingram's even playing for the national team and looking pretty good. Obviously, he's not the absolute star of that team because there's just too much talent on that roster, but he's at least sort of showing out and contributing to the national team ahead of the FIBA World Cup. So the Pelicans have a lot to be excited for, and if Zion gets added to what's already a pretty solid core, I think that they could definitely take that next step up. So the Pelicans for my team to overperform. In terms of a team that's most likely to underperform, unfortunately, we do have to talk about the Los Angeles Clippers again here because it's basically the opposite situation of the Pelicans. I said the Pelicans are a strong team, and if Zion is healthy, they can get even better. The Clippers kind of go in the other direction. They need Paul George and Kawhi Leonard to be healthy. This is not a situation where the Clippers are a solid squad that's just waiting for their stars to come back. We don't really know what the Clippers look like. Well, what they look like at their full strength, I guess is the way we would say this, right? They had Kawhi for some stretches, they had Paul George for some stretches, they very rarely had both at the same time. So if neither one of those players is at 100% or one of them isn't, then the Clippers may have to play some or all of their group play matches without them. And that kind of makes things rough because if you look at the Clippers lineup, if Paul George and Kawhi Leonard are healthy, then I think the Clippers supporting cast is built pretty damn well to support that duo, right? They're looking pretty good, especially if Russell Westbrook just continues to play the way that he did after they picked him up last season. What they've built around Paul George and Kawhi Leonard looks pretty good. But when one or both of those players are missing, the Clippers built too much of a supporting cast with no one to support. We saw in their series in the playoffs, they do kind of fall apart a little bit. They're capable of putting up a fight, right? Let's not completely discount them at this stage, but without their star players, the roster can't win on its own. It wasn't built to win without Paul George and Kawhi Leonard. So that's why I think they have the most potential to sort of disappoint and fall below projections because they are so unbelievably dependent on those two star players. And if they don't have one or both of them, it feels like they're going to sink through those standings or in those standings pretty damn quickly, even at the start of the season. So a lot of health being the question for teams in West Group B here, which is very unfortunate for those teams because, again, they've got to contend with the defending champions who bring back like 95% of that championship roster. So honestly, I think Denver does have some pretty smooth sailing in this group, but outside of them, it's going to be a bloodbath, right? The Clippers, the Pelicans, the Mavericks are all going to be fighting for a second place spot, and I think the Rockets aren't content to just sit back and lose games basically intentionally anymore. They're going to at least try to compete, and if you're a team here, right, the Mavs, the Pels, and the Clippers, if you lose one of those games to Houston, that could be enough to sink your chances in what's a pretty sort of packed middle group here of these three teams. So Houston has the chance to maybe play spoiler and sink someone's hopes of moving beyond the group stage. But that's all I've got here for West Group B. It's a pretty straightforward hierarchy, right? Denver at the top, Houston at the bottom, everyone else fighting in the middle. But let me know what you think. Do you think any of these teams are on par with the Nuggets right now? I would find that hard to believe, but I could certainly see some arguments for it. Of those three teams I listed, Clippers, Pels, and Mavericks, which one do you think is maybe the odd one out, the one who should have maybe been thrown down a spot? I would guess a lot of people's pick there would be the Mavericks because obviously their season did not end well. But let me know what you think, and do you think the Rockets have some sort of miracle run in them? Are Fred VanVleet and Dylan Brooks enough to change the culture there and get them into a position where they're winning in the first 2 months of the season? Seems unlikely, but hey, at this point anything is possible. But feel free to share your thoughts. Let me know what you think. Other than that, though, thank you all so much for watching, and I will talk to you later.